Sometimes when you sleep, you don't actually dream. Dreams are of the mind. They're entirely internalized, an aspect of the Vishuddhi in a very pure sense. Of course, the images that we see in the dream world are informed by yajna, communication with the sahasrara, the spirit, spiritual prana, which feeds manifestations of images that we perceive at the third eye. This is our inner vision or our subtle sight. But dreams are entirely internalized. But sometimes when you sleep, you will experience something that is like a dream, but it is not a dream. It is an externalized experience. And in Tantra, we call this subtle space. It is the space that exists between the mind and the spirit. And it is within subtle space that we are able to perceive dimensions of consciousness that are beyond what we would typically consider to be reality. Of course, reality is far more complex than what most modern thinkers would define it to be. There are many dimensions of consciousness beyond the present. And sometimes we can slip into those dimensions accidentally. Or it might seem like slipping into those dimensions has occurred as a result of an accident, but actually it's a process of karma that has led to this event, this opening of the doors of perception into a new world. And so I'm going to give you an example of one of my travels into one of these other dimensions of consciousness beyond the one that you are presently experiencing. I went to sleep and I found myself in a snowy region, remote, somewhere in the forest, and there was a very large cabin there. And I knew immediately that this was not simply a dream, because I've practiced Tantra for long enough to be able to recognize the difference between the dream world and subtle space, pocket dimensions. There is a stark contrast between these experiences. Of course, you have to understand how to identify the markers of these varying experiences, and that requires time, it requires practice. You have to know the difference between that which exists purely in the mind and that which exists externally as well. And so I found myself in some realm of subtle space, in this cold, snow-covered environment with this large wooden cabin. And at this cabin was a man in his mid-50s. I didn't recognize him. Now, keep in mind, I was completely lucid during this experience. I knew that I had slipped into some type of pocket dimension. And so I could feel everything. Everything was occurring in a perception of time that mirrors the perception of time that I'm experiencing right now in this present dimension of consciousness. And so I knew something strange had happened. I didn't set any intention to travel to any specific realm prior to going to sleep, but here I found myself in this strange place. And so I spoke to this man. I said, where are we? And he was very afraid. He had no idea how he had come to this place. And so I had determined that this man was either some type of astral traveler or maybe something else. But I didn't know what. I didn't know where the hell we were. And then I walked out on the porch, walked around, was looking at the forest. I saw no signs of civilization in the distance, just endless, cold forest. And I turned around and I looked through a sliding glass door into a very dark room. And standing in that room was the faint shadow of a man dressed in a suit. And he was giving off an extremely sinister presence. And I knew that this was bad because I have had many experiences traveling to different pocket dimensions where I could experience everything with such intensity that it was like my waking life as I would experience things right now in this dimension of consciousness. And so I knew this was going to be rough. And I went back into the cabin and I told this man that was with me that we needed to get out of here. This was not good. He looked very afraid whenever I told him this. And I said, "Don't worry, we will find a way out." And right at that time, a package arrived. We heard a knock on the door. We opened the door, and there was the package, but no one was there. It was a long box. And on the box, there was red lettering. And it said, "Be careful who opens this." I told the man that I was with not to open the box, but immediately he tore it open. And I grabbed his hands and I said, "No, do not open this any further." And I looked inside the box, and there were instructions, initiatory instructions, which stated that this cabin was going to host a game. And in that game, murderers were going to be welcomed to the cabin for a gladiatorial event. And as part of this event, you would have to kill everyone else in the cabin or around the cabin in order to be able to escape. You'd be set free if you could prove yourself. And I had experienced something like this in the past in some of my subtle space travels, but I was able to avoid it. This time, though, I had this man with me. In the past, I was by myself. Uh, but I told this man that I would help him escape. I would find a way to release us from this dimension. And so, right at the time that I read this initiatory statement, all of a sudden, all of these vehicles started appearing on the property, and people started getting out of their cars. And it suddenly occurred to me, I had this feeling that I was in a Buddhist hell realm. Now, that was strange because I don't usually have that kind of innate feeling of where I'm at whenever I'm traveling in subtle space and I find myself in some seemingly random destination. But this time, I just felt like I was in some kind of Buddhist hell. And that made a little bit of sense to me because I'd been doing some work with tantric Buddhist deities recently. So all of these murderers begin to accumulate around the cabin. And I grab the man by his shoulder and I walk him into another room. And I say, you stay here. I'm going to see what's happening. And I walk out onto the yard. And it was strange because everyone there, they had this feeling about them like this was some kind of fun, like a festival, a carnival or something like that. And they started to fall into little groups, little clans. And then I realized what was happening. These people, they had done this before, and they had formed some kind of democracy, some type of system for how to handle the inevitable violence. They realized that if they were going to win, they were going to come out on top in this game of blood and guts, tooth and claw, they would need to form an alliance. They would need to form little groups, clans, little states. And so they started to congregate with some of their friends, I guess you could say. But of course, there weren't any real friends in this place because you couldn't trust anyone. Only one man or woman would survive this. Now, at this time, I knew this was going to be a terrible experience because, like I said, I could feel everything. I was completely lucid. I could feel every little subtle sensation. I could feel the cold. I could feel the clothes on my body. I could feel everything. And so I realized, okay, this is a realm of great violence. I'm probably going to be exposed to great violence. And so I had to temper myself. I had to prepare myself for this experience. And I found a group of these murderers who had accumulated sort of like a small little organization. And I thought, okay, I'm going to speak with them to see if I can get any information on what was about to occur. Because, like I said, it was almost like there was an impromptu democracy or republic forming where there were unspoken rules of conduct that kept everything in some degree of order so that the entire event did not just immediately erupt into chaotic bloodshed. And so I went to this group of people and I asked them what was going on, and they said, "Oh, they laughed, and they said, "Oh, okay, I see. It's your first time here." They said, "You better get ready because we're gonna get started soon." And I knew that I couldn't trust any of these people. I wasn't really welcome there, so I kept walking around, and I saw a few fights break out. Nothing serious. They were broken up, and I went into this hall. It was this building that was adjacent to the cabin. I hadn't recognized it at first, and I thought maybe it had been constructed quickly because as soon as all these vehicles started showing up, tents were popping up all over the place. It's kind of like a music festival almost, but for killing. And I went into this hall and I sat down next to this girl, this blonde girl. She was probably 16 or 17, I thought. But she had this essence about her, like she was a vicious killer, absolutely brutal person. And she was going through this medical bag, looking at her scalpels and a few other instruments. And I looked at this man across from me. He had a beard and greasy clothes. And he said, "You know, when we come to this place, we're only allowed to use the items that we used when we took our victim's life in order to escape this place." I thought that was really interesting. And of course, I was watching my back, watching my sides the entire time because I didn't know when someone might try to kill me. But there was still relative peace. And all of this chatter started. People were getting excited. I could tell, okay, things are about to get a little bit more active here. And I looked over at this girl on my right going through her bag, and there was a man next to her. He was sitting very close to her, and I thought they might have some sort of relationship. I would later find out that this was her father. She was going through her bag and she picked out this one razor. She was holding it up, and then this man said, "Here, let me see that, honey," and grabbed it from her. And then he slit her throat immediately. Blood shot everywhere, all over everyone in the immediate area, all over me. And everyone started laughing. And one of them said, "Man, that's really fucked up that you would do that to your own daughter." And he started laughing too, and he said, "Yeah, she didn't expect that this time. Usually I let her stay with me to the end." And I realized this was a joke. This was a joke to these people because they had gone through the process of dying and reincarnating in this hell realm over and over again. So even though they did care, some of them cared to escape, a lot of them enjoyed this. They enjoyed existing in an environment where they could indulge in their animalistic fantasies as many times as they'd like. And that's the thing about heaven and hell. It's a matter of perception. One man's hell is another man's heaven. For many of these men and women, the idea of being able to kill with very little discrimination for eternity, that was heaven. And so a lot of them, they wanted to remain in this place. But I wanted to get the fuck out as soon as possible. And so I was the only one not laughing. I had a very disturbed look on my face, and the man who cut his daughter's throat looked at me. He said, "Oh, does that disturb you? Are you bothered by this?" And I didn't say anything to him. He took my arm and slashed it, which hurt very bad. I could feel everything. And he started laughing, and I grabbed the razor blade from his hand and cut him to pieces. Just absolutely tore him to shreds in front of everyone. I made a big show out of it, just so everyone else around me would know not to fuck with me. And when I was done, they all looked a little bit shocked, but then they started giggling about the whole thing, and I realized I have to go find that man that I said I would protect. So I went back to where I left him, but he was gone. And right about that time, I heard this big bell ring, and all of a sudden, everything erupted into chaos, and all of these people started killing each other. So I was ducking, I was trying to hide and find my way out of this room. And I did. I found a door to the outside. I ran out into the snow, and I ran into the woods. Most of the activity was occurring around the cabin. I saw, hidden behind a tree, this figure that was crouched down on the ground, and I looked, and it was that man that I had left. And he was crying. He was very scared. And I told him, "Listen, we are in a very bad place, and we have to get out of here. And I promise you that I'm going to stick with you now. I'm not going to leave you. We're going to find our way out of here." So I helped him up, and we were walking through the woods, and all of a sudden, um, there were these people who recognized us, and he got scared and started running off. Ran after him, and they started chasing us. They took a hold of this man, and they started to beat him. And so I grabbed them, and I threw the murderers off of this man. And I knew that we were pretty much fucked because we were surrounded. I didn't have a weapon. He didn't have a weapon. So I threw myself on top of him, and then I felt the knives going into my side. I felt the bat crack against my skull. I felt all of this pain, and it was terrible. It was really horrific pain. and I could see all the blood flowing out onto the snow around me, just absolutely soaking the environment. And I realized, oh, I'm going to die, and I might have to repeat this entire process. But then, as everything was fading to black, I woke up. I woke up and I sat up and I thought about what had happened for a moment. And then I heard this name come into my awareness, what we call the subtle sound. Just like if you were to hear a song come into your mind when no music was playing around you. And the name that came to me was Maheshvara. Now, Maheshvara is a Buddhist form of Shiva. And then I realized the identity of the man, or at least what I think the identity of the man was. I believe that the man I covered up was an incarnation of Maheshvara. And when I had this realization, I felt this very intense shift of awareness to the Vishuddhi, the throat, and everything from the throat up in terms of consciousness. A very intense, contemplative, divine masculine presence. It was sort of like the inverse of Shinamasta or Vajrayogini. Vajrayogini brings your awareness to everything below the throat, as does Shinamasta. And then I realized, that teenage girl that had her throat cut, that might have been some incarnation of Vajrayogini. She's usually depicted as a 16-year-old with red skin. And sometimes she's associated with the cutting of the throat or the cutting off of the head so that you can release yourself into the active world. Well, she wasn't red at first, but after her throat was cut, she was completely covered in red, and everyone around her was covered in red. And it was that act, that murder of this girl, that spurred me to action. And I thought about the implications of this. I realized that this realm I had entered into was sort of like a mirror of our present dimension, where there are enticements concerning violence. People become scared, or they're just so full of bloodlust that everything in life is focused upon coming out on top in this game of tooth and claw. And that's the only consideration. And some people derive great pleasure from that, and others are swept up into it. There are some who indulge in these acts of violence, and there's others who are compelled by them. And that realm that I had entered into, it was filled with people who were indulging in the violence and some who were compelled by it. For some, that was a hell realm of great compulsion that they so desperately wanted to escape. And for others, it was a heaven. It was a place of great bloody fun. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Buddhist hells, they contain some form of Buddha who aids those who wish to escape the realm. If you can learn the lesson of the Buddha, you can escape. And I believe that I encountered some aspect of the Buddha in this realm, and they helped me to escape, and they taught me a lesson that is relevant to myself, but also to others. As I am a teacher of Tantra, when I have these interactions with these aspects of subtle space, it teaches me something about not just that dimension, but every other dimension that could be some sort of reflection of that experience. In this world, we have clans that form all the time. We have states that form. And these states form with the goal of monopolizing violence and then utilizing that violence in order to establish power. And in that environment of violence, there are these systems, these codes that form between these states. And it's not so clear where the law begins and ends. Because when it comes right down to it, blood will be spilled, people will die, and someone is going to be the last man standing. And the lesson that you can take from that is that if you want to accumulate the karma of living your life with the sole purpose of being the last man standing in the game of tooth and claw, you should consider what kind of world you're creating for yourself in this present dimension and also upon death, because the karma that we accumulate here echoes into eternity. And personally, I don't want to spend my days in a never-ending game of death and destruction. You know, we find these kinds of realms in many different traditions. In the Germanic tradition, if you're a great warrior, if you live your life by the sword, if you die by the sword, you might be chosen for Valhalla. And in Valhalla, you wake up every morning, you go to the battlefield, you fight, and you die. And then you do it all over again. It's a murder realm. It's a realm for murderers and killers. And you can slap whatever label you want on it. You can call it glory, you can call it honor, whatever you want. But the fact of the matter is, it's a place for killing. It is a home for murderers. And that's not a value judgment. It's just the fact of the matter. So if you live your life as a killer, as an animal, as a murderer, if you live by fang and claw, consider the world that you are shaping within yourself, within your environment, within your next incarnation, because you just might find yourself in a cabin in the cold woods with nice, pristine, white snow waiting to be painted with your blood.